I've owned my ranch for 5 years now, and in that time, I've dealt with my fair share of nonsense. Storms knocking out the power, coyotes sneaking too close to the chickens, even the occasional lost city slicker thinking my private road was a scenic detour. But nothing prepared me for the sheer stupidity of what happened last Saturday. It started with a truck rolling up my driveway, kicking up a dust cloud so thick I couldn't see the driver at first. I was out by the barn, checking on the fence posts, when the thing came to a halt just outside my front gate. The truck was white, a little too clean for real work, with HOA Patrol stamped in bold blue letters on the side. That was my first red flag. See, I don't live in an HOA. My ranch sits on 50 acres of unincorporated land, meaning no one gets to tell me what to do with it except the county. And even they don't bother me much. So when two guys in matching polo shirts and khakis stepped out, clipboards in hand, I already knew this was going to be stupid. The older one, a short, balding guy with an attitude that smelled like cheap cologne and self-importance, puffed out his chest and squinted at me like I was a problem he was about to fix. The younger one, tall and lanky, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "You the property owner?" the short one demanded. I leaned on my shovel. "Who's asking?" He flashed a badge, an actual badge, like he thought this was some kind of law enforcement situation. It said, HOA Compliance Officer, with his name underneath, Franklin Moore. I almost laughed. Almost. "We're with the Oak Crest Homeowners Association," Franklin announced, like that was supposed to mean something to me. "We're here to conduct an inspection." I raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" Franklin adjusted his clipboard. "Your property. There have been multiple complaints about unauthorized structures, unapproved fencing, and livestock violations." Now I did laugh. Livestock violations? Buddy, I own a ranch. You might as well complain about sand in the desert. The younger guy shuffled uncomfortably, but Franklin didn't waver. "We need to take a look around. If you're found in violation of HOA guidelines, you'll need to address the issues immediately." I took a slow step forward. "Let me stop you right there, Franklin. This isn't Oak Crest. This is my land, outside HOA jurisdiction. So, you and your patrol can go ahead and turn that truck around." Franklin's face did this little twitch, like no one had ever told him no before. "This property is adjacent to Oak Crest," he said, like he was explaining something obvious. "New regulations allow us to extend compliance checks to neighboring properties that may impact community aesthetics." I blinked. "Did you just say community aesthetics?" Franklin nodded. "Yes. We received multiple complaints about your," he checked his notes, "unsightly barn, non-uniform fencing, and excessive animal presence." I let that hang in the air for a moment. Then I stepped closer, making sure Franklin really understood what he was dealing with. "You're telling me," I said slowly, "that a bunch of HOA busybodies think they can dictate how a ranch looks? Out here? On private, non-HOA land?" Franklin cleared his throat. "We're trying to maintain standards." I folded my arms. "Oh, I've got some standards for you. Get off my land." The younger guy, sensing things were about to go south, tapped Franklin's arm. "Maybe we should check with the board before we..." Franklin brushed him off. "Sir, if you don't comply, we'll be forced to escalate this matter. Non-compliance could result in fines." "Fines?" I repeated. "And how exactly do you plan to enforce those?" Franklin smirked. "We have ways." I could feel my patience burning up like dry grass in August. I'd had enough. I turned, walked over to the main gate, and grabbed the padlock and chain hanging on the post. With slow, deliberate movements, I looped it through the gate, clicked the lock shut, and turned back to them. "There," I said. "Inspection's over. Now, you're trespassing. Leave." The younger guy took a step back. "Franklin, not so much. You can't just," he started. I pulled out my phone and held it up. "I can. And I will. You've got 10 seconds before I call the sheriff and let him know I've got trespassers on my property pretending to have authority they don't." Franklin's face turned red. His mouth opened, then closed. Then, without another word, he stormed back to the truck. The younger guy followed, throwing me an apologetic look. They got in, slammed the doors, and peeled out so fast they kicked gravel into the ditch. I shook my head and muttered, "Idiots." But I should have known that wasn't the end of it. Because the next morning, I woke up to something much, much worse. I woke up the next morning feeling pretty good about shutting Franklin down. Nothing like sending self-important HOA clowns packing to start the weekend off right. I figured that was the end of it, just another ridiculous encounter to laugh about later. Turns out, Franklin wasn't the kind of guy to take a loss gracefully. It started with the letter. I found it taped to my front gate, flapping in the wind like some kind of official proclamation. Printed on fancy HOA letterhead, it was addressed to me by name, which meant they had gone out of their way to figure out exactly who I was. Not a great sign. I skimmed through the legalese until I hit the important part. Failure to comply with Oak Crest HOA regulations will result in escalating enforcement actions, including financial penalties and potential legal action. I actually laughed out loud at that. Legal action? Against someone who didn't even live in their HOA? These people were delusional. I flipped the page over and saw a list of violations they claimed I needed to address immediately. Unapproved fencing, because apparently my barbed wire wasn't aesthetically pleasing. Unauthorized livestock. My cattle had existed longer than Oak Crest had. Non-uniform structures. My barn, the same one that had been standing for decades. At the bottom, they helpfully included a deadline. 72 hours to comply. Now, I've dealt with all kinds of people over the years. Hardworking ranchers, city folk who think eggs come from grocery stores, and the occasional government official trying to make life more difficult than it needs to be. But this was next-level stupid. I crumpled up the letter and tossed it into the back of my truck. I had real work to do. About an hour later, I was fixing the irrigation system out in the pasture when I heard the unmistakable sound of engines, a whole fleet of them. I turned and saw 3 white HOA trucks rolling up my driveway. And behind them, a full construction crew. Flatbed trucks. Stacks of fencing materials. Workers in reflective vests. I stood there, absolutely dumbfounded, as they pulled to a stop just outside my gate. Then out stepped Franklin, now dressed in a blazer like he was here to host a press conference. The construction guys started unloading. On my property. I dropped my tools and stalked over. What the hell do you think you're doing? Franklin had that same smug look as yesterday. Enforcing compliance. I glanced at the workers, who were already unloading posts. You hired a crew to trespass on my land and replace my fence. Franklin sighed, like I was the unreasonable one. The HOA has determined your fencing is not up to community standards. Since you failed to act within the provided time frame, we're addressing the issue on your behalf. I took a slow breath. You do not have jurisdiction here. He smiled. We do, actually. A new HOA amendment allows enforcement on adjacent properties that impact community aesthetics. I clenched my jaw. That's not how laws work, Franklin. He just shrugged. If you disagree, you're welcome to file an appeal. But in the meantime, we're proceeding. The workers had already started pulling down a section of my fence. I saw red. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Let me be clear. You and your crew are trespassing on private property. You do not have permission to alter anything here. I'm giving you exactly 30 seconds to pack up and leave before I call the sheriff. Franklin actually laughed. Call whoever you want. He gestured to one of the workers. Keep going. That was it. I dialed. Sheriff's office. A familiar voice answered. Hey, Deputy Moore, I said, keeping my voice calm even though my blood was boiling. I've got a situation at my ranch. Trespassers claiming HOA authority and tearing down my fence. There was a pause. Then, HOA? But you're not even in. Exactly, I cut in. Can you send someone? I'll be there in 10. I ended the call and looked back at Franklin. Hope you brought a chair, because you're about to get real familiar with the inside of a squad car. He scoffed. We're conducting lawful enforcement. I pointed at my no trespassing sign. You're conducting a crime, genius. The workers, sensing things were getting dicey, had slowed down. Some had even stopped completely. Then, right on cue, I heard the distant wail of a siren. Franklin paled. I crossed my arms. That's what I thought. A few minutes later, a patrol car pulled up, and Deputy Moore stepped out. He was a big guy, ex-military, no patience for nonsense. He took one look at the scene and let out a long sigh. What's going on here? Franklin immediately puffed up. We're enforcing HOA compliance on a neighboring property per new regulations. Moore didn't even blink. What regulations? Franklin produced some paperwork, all neatly printed and stapled. Moore skimmed it. Then he laughed. This, he said, waving the papers, means nothing outside HOA limits. Franklin bristled. I don't think you understand. Moore cut him off. I understand you're on private property without permission. That's called trespassing. Franklin opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. We have the legal right. No, you don't, Moore said flatly. Then he looked at me. You want them gone? I nodded. Moore turned back to Franklin. Pack it up. Now. Franklin clenched his jaw, humiliated, but he knew better than to argue with a badge. The workers, who had been waiting for an excuse to leave, started loading their trucks immediately. Moore gave Franklin one last look. I suggest you don't pull a stunt like this again. Next time, you won't get a warning. I smirked. Oh, I want him to try again. I've got some free time and a lawyer who loves a good lawsuit. Franklin turned a shade of purple I'd never seen before. Without another word, he stomped back to his truck, got in, and peeled out of there, tail tucked between his legs. I shook my head, watching them retreat. Unbelievable, Moore muttered. Think they'll try again? I asked. Moore sighed. With guys like that, wouldn't be surprised. And unfortunately, he was right, because the next move the HOA made was even worse. I thought that was the end of it. The sheriff had sent Franklin and his goons packing, and I figured they'd learned their lesson. I was wrong. The HOA wasn't just licking its wounds. No, they were plotting. And 2 days later, they hit me with their next brilliant idea, weaponizing the county against me. It started with another letter, this time from the county zoning board. At first, I thought it was routine paperwork. But as I read through it, my stomach dropped. Notice of zoning violations. This property has been reported for multiple code violations, including unpermitted structures, failure to adhere to livestock regulations, excessive environmental impact. At the bottom, it stated that if I didn't correct these violations within 14 days, I could be fined or even face legal action. I stared at the letter. What the hell? I knew my property was up to code. I had all the necessary permits for my barn, my fencing was compliant, and my livestock was well within the legal limit. This wasn't an accident. This was the HOA trying to sick the county on me. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my keys and drove straight to the county zoning office. The woman at the front desk, Linda, had been working there forever. She knew every farmer, rancher, and landowner in the area. When I handed her the notice, she frowned. This doesn't make sense, she said, flipping through her computer. Your property's been in compliance since you bought it. Exactly, I said. So who filed the complaint? She tapped a few keys. Then she sighed and turned the screen toward me. Filed by Oak Crest Homeowners Association. I clenched my jaw. Unbelievable. Linda shook her head. They don't have jurisdiction over you. Tell them that. She gave me a sympathetic look. I'll have an inspector come out and verify everything. If your property checks out, which I know it will, we'll clear this up. That was good news, but I wasn't about to sit back and wait. Because if Franklin wanted to play dirty, I could play dirtier. That day, I made some calls. First, I called my lawyer, an old friend who specialized in property law. When I explained the situation, he laughed. Let me get this straight, he said. A homeowners association is trying to enforce rules on land outside its jurisdiction? Yep. They're filing false complaints with the county? Sure are. He whistled. That's fraud. I grinned. Exactly. Then I called the local newspaper. See, small towns love a good scandal. And an HOA trying to illegally control land they don't own? That's front page material. By morning, I had an inspector scheduled, a legal case forming, and a journalist sniffing around for dirt. 3 days later, the county inspector, Dave, showed up. I walked him through my property, and, as expected, everything was perfectly legal. At the end of the inspection, he shook his head. This is a waste of time. You're 100% compliant. Mind putting that in writing? I asked. Already working on it. But just as he was finishing up, guess who showed up? Yep, Franklin. He rolled up in his HOA truck, parked right outside my gate, and marched up with his clipboard like he had any authority. Dave raised an eyebrow. Who's this? I smirked. The clown who filed the false complaint. Franklin ignored me and turned to Dave. We need to ensure compliance with community standards. Dave crossed his arms. Community standards don't apply here. This isn't HOA property. Franklin puffed up. This land affects the overall aesthetic of Oak Crest. Dave laughed. That's not a legal argument. Franklin's eye twitched. Then we'll escalate this matter to county leadership. Dave handed me the official report, the one that cleared me of all violations, and looked back at Franklin. You do that, he said. But if you keep filing false reports, you might find yourself in trouble for abusing county resources. Franklin's face went bright red. He stormed off without another word. And as soon as he was gone, I called my lawyer. It's time, I said. Let's take this to court. Because if the HOA thought they could bully me, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. If there's one thing HOAs hate, it's bad press. So when the local paper ran the headline, HOA overreach, local rancher fights back against illegal enforcement, you better believe Oak Crest's board members lost their minds. The article went into every dirty detail. The HOA trying to enforce rules outside their jurisdiction, the false complaints they filed with the county, the attempted fence replacement that nearly got Franklin arrested. It even included a quote from the sheriff, who outright called their actions borderline harassment. The best part? The comment section was a bloodbath. As an Oak Crest homeowner, I want to know who authorized this nonsense. My HOA fees better not be paying for Franklin's little power trip. At Real Steve D. This guy doesn't even live in Oak Crest. Leave him alone. What's next? HOA rules for neighboring towns. At Linda TX. Someone needs to be fired over this. At Cowboy Up 57. It was beautiful. The same day the article went live, my lawyer filed a lawsuit. Grounds? Harassment. Defamation. Filing false complaints. Attempted trespassing and destruction of property. And since Franklin had acted on behalf of the HOA, that meant the entire board was on the hook. My lawyer made sure they got the message loud and clear. By the next morning, every HOA board member received a formal legal notice. Franklin, he got served at his front door, in full view of his nosy neighbors. It didn't take long for the panic to set in. The next HOA meeting was a complete disaster. Homeowners packed the room, demanding answers. One guy even stood up and yelled, "Why the hell are we getting sued over land that's not even OURS?" Franklin tried to defend himself. He really did. But the second he opened his mouth, someone shouted, "Shut up, Franklin." And just like that, the floodgates opened. Did you really hire a construction crew without permission? Do you have any idea how much this lawsuit could cost us? How much of our fees went into this mess? Franklin was sweating bullets. He tried to blame the board. The board tried to blame Franklin. It was glorious. Then, the HOA treasurer dropped the real bombshell. The HOA had already spent thousands trying to enforce their fake rules on my land. The legal fees to fight my lawsuit? Even more. That's when people really lost it. One woman stood up and flat out demanded Franklin resign on the spot. And when he tried to protest, the entire room booed him. By the end of the meeting, Franklin was forced to resign. And as for the rest of the board, 3 more members quit the next day. The HOA was in shambles. And just when they thought things couldn't get any worse, I doubled down. Because this lawsuit, it wasn't just about winning. It was about making an example out of them. And I was just getting started. Franklin was out. The HOA board was falling apart. But I wasn't done yet. See, these people didn't just annoy me. They trespassed, filed false complaints, and tried to steal control of my land. That wasn't just HOA stupidity, it was malicious. So I made sure they got what they deserved. Franklin might have resigned, but he was still on the hook legally. And since he'd acted on behalf of the HOA, that meant the entire organization was responsible for the mess. My lawyer was ruthless. The false zoning complaints, abuse of county resources, the trespassing and attempted property destruction, civil liability, the harassment, easily provable, thanks to my recordings. The HOA's legal team took one look at the evidence and knew they were screwed. A few weeks later, they caved. The HOA agreed to a full settlement. They had to pay for all legal fees, mine included. They had to issue a public apology in the local newspaper. They were barred from ever interfering with my land again. Oh, and Franklin, I made sure he got personally named in the lawsuit. The settlement required him to pay damages out of his own pocket. Remember all those homeowners who were furious about Franklin's antics? They started digging into the HOA's finances. And guess what they found? Mismanaged funds. Ridiculous fines issued to homeowners for petty violations. Money spent on HOA patrols that no one approved. It was a financial dumpster fire. So what did the homeowners do? They held a special election and voted to dissolve the HOA completely. By the end of it all, Franklin lost his HOA position, his reputation, and a chunk of his savings. The HOA no longer existed. My ranch, completely untouched, just as it should be. And the best part? About a month later, I got a letter from Franklin. A personal one. I hope you're happy. You ruined my career. I framed it right next to my no trespassing sign. Because if anyone ever tries this nonsense again, they'll know exactly how it ends. Thank you for listening to this story. Please share in the comments where you are from and if you enjoyed it, and see you next time.